Hello, everyone who's joined us today, and welcome to this UCL Connect event on navigating personal and professional differences. I'm Gerard Jones, and I work in the UCL Alumni Relations team, and I'm very excited about today's event. Emily, could we please have the next slide? I'll just quickly introduce UCL Connect. A lot of you will know this already, but it is our personal and professional development series where we cover a real variety of themes. So, whether you're a recent graduate looking to explore your pathways, or perhaps you're established in your career and you want to delve into a certain topic, or perhaps you're moving industry, there really is something for everybody here. And we tend to run around 9 events a year, which sort of works out to one a term. They're a mix of in-person and virtual and a mix of formats. So as I say, there really is something for everybody. So do keep an eye out in the alumni newsletter for more that are coming up. Emily, next slide. Just take a look here at the sort of range of topics we've covered in the past. So you'll see things like mastering motivation, aging well, building a side hustle, building your personal brand, avoiding caregivers burnout, etc. So again, as I say, a real range. And if you do want to watch any previous sessions, just go to the link below or simply Google UCL Connect. Next slide, please, Emily. So just before we begin today's event, a little bit of housekeeping. So the event is being recorded, so please do ensure your microphone is on mute. You're very welcome to use the Q&A chat box at any point during the session. So the way it's going to work is we're going to have a sort of 35-minute panel discussion from our experts on the call here. And then we'll use the final sort of 15, 20 minutes to cover questions from the audience. So timings are quite tight, but we'll do our best to cover as many questions as possible. And finally, for those of you that do need live captions, you will see 3 dots and the word more on your screen. So if you click that and then click captions and then show captions, you'll be able to get those should you require them. Next slide, please, Emily. So as I say, we're going to have a fantastic panel event today. Obviously, navigating personal and professional differences is perhaps more important now than ever before. We live in an increasingly global world. Workforces are more diverse than ever. And also political beliefs can be polarizing and can vary significantly. So there is a real need to sort of bridge differences and come together. I won't say too much on it. I'm going to hand over to an excellent panel of people here today. You'll see their bios and you'll no doubt have probably looked them up before the event. Emily, next slide. Just to recap the format, we're going to start with some introductions from the panel, have around 35 minutes for the panel to discuss, and then around 15 to 20 minutes at the end for Q&A. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Professor Nerina Hertz to chair this discussion, and I will turn my camera off. Over to you, Nerina.
Thank you, Gerard. Hi, everybody. I'm Nerina Hertz. I'm a professor here at UCL who works at the intersection of economics, politics, society, and technology. And I also sit on the boards of some big companies. And it's this dual mindset, theory and practice that I want to bring to my chairing today. Negotiating differences in the workplace. Well, from the number of people who've signed up for this event, this is clearly a topic of interest. And it makes sense that it is, because the relationships that we have with our co-workers determine how happy we are at work, how engaged, and also how productive. Being able to manage our differences, therefore, is good for us as individuals, but also good for the businesses that we work for. But the reality is that navigating differences in the workplace can at times be challenging, especially nowadays, which is why having more insight into how to manage situations when one has different opinions to your colleagues on what needs to be done, or a different perspective on who should do what, or a different point of view about what success looks like, or helping figure out how to navigate different communication styles or different worldviews is all really important. So I'm delighted to have a great panel with us today who'll be giving their insights and providing you with constructive takeaways that you can use in your day-to-day. I'm going to begin by asking our panelists to introduce themselves briefly, and then we'll have a discussion for about 30 minutes. and leave the last 20 minutes for questions from you. So please do think about these and add them into the Q&A function on the Zoom, and then we'll come back to them later. So Naomi, Nathan, Faye, Rahul, can we begin please by you introducing yourselves?
Hi, thank you so much. Should I start? Is that what you meant by introducing me first?
Yes, please. Just start with just 1 or 2 sentences on who you are in case people haven't had a chance to see your bio.
Yeah, of course. Okay. Hi, everybody, and welcome to the talk. It's a great pleasure to be here. My name's Naomi. I'm a careers practitioner and an educational consultant. I started a company called Strategic Education. And alongside that, I also work in research in this area. So I do a little bit of research at Warwick University in education and careers. And the kind of curveball in my story is that I'm also a creative artist, a singer, and a writer.
Thank you. Nathan?
Yes, hi, I'm Nathan Nalla. That was a real curveball. It threw me for a second. I wasn't expecting that. But yeah, I'm the founder and director of Be The Riot, creating inclusive culture within organizations. And so our mission is to ensure that within the organizations that we work with, it doesn't matter who you are, what background you're from, how you identify, or what circumstances you're from. Everyone should be able to thrive within the place that they work and also go on to thrive within their careers. What this looks like in practice is supporting organizations to develop strategy for equity, diversity, and inclusion, and provide educational support, so learning workshops, etc. My link to UCL is that back in 2023, I attended a course on behavior change interventions, which it's been really interesting merging that sort of learning into the work that I do.
Thank you, Nathan. Faye?
Hi everyone, my name is Fayola Maria Jack, or Faye for short. I'm Chief Executive Officer of an organisation called Resolution. It's a global organisation that focuses on conflict and dispute resolution and how to aid more successful relationships. So my link to UCL, I did my MBA with UCL back in 2021, and since then I've stayed connected to our alumni environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Faye. And last, Rahul.
Hi, everyone. Pleasure to be here. I'm Rahul. My link to UCL goes a lot further back, I think. I did my undergrad here and graduated in 2013, and then have since done an MBA at Warwick Business School, where I graduated in 2022. I currently lead a jewelry manufacturer and retailer called Vicky Sarge, but my background is actually in strategic and operational HR. And most recently, I led the HR function for a global multinational scale-up retailer, but started life in retail on the shop floor. So when I was actually at UCL, I had my part-time job, probably spent far too many hours doing that. And what I learned from that was that solving people problems was an everyday occurrence and actually the biggest part of my role. So I wanted to use my operational experience to bridge the unseen gaps between organizations and their people, and hopefully ultimately benefit all parties involved.
Well, it seems like with this real array of experience and background, you guys are going to bring great insights into the conversation. And I wanted to start with maybe a slightly provocative question. Faye, is difference of opinion a bad thing at work? Something we should be scared about?
So my view is absolutely not. Constructive conflict is positive, and it is the difference of ideas, perspectives, approaches that all comes from differences in knowledge and experience. And I think that true consensus is actually a fallacy. We see that even at the macro level. So if we think about organizations, they have differing values, missions, policies, priorities, and that's normal. So difference is not negative. It's not even always obvious. I think it's the poor attitudes and approaches to identify differences that can create problems. So many of us, including myself, will accept that difference can be a real catalyst for innovation. It can be a catalyst for growth. We call this the benefit of divergent thinking. But it can be handled in a way that creates material disruption, and that's when it becomes bad. So in my view, I think the outcomes of difference, positive and negative, are in fact the result of choices that people make at a macro organizational level or at a micro individual level.
So, if I understand you correctly, Faye, you're saying actually it's good to have different divergent points of view because that's how we get innovation and that's how we get creative thinking. And actually, there's a vast body of research that shows that diverse opinion and diverse points of view kind of deliver in terms of innovation and creativity. But you're also saying, presumably, you don't want everyone shouting at each other and making the workplace a kind of unpleasant place. Is that right?
Absolutely that. We are all different as individuals, and that's really important. It's the way that we manage that difference that makes the kind of positive environment at work or makes the environment very negative. And that's what we need to be conscious about, I think, as individuals.
So that raises the question, how do we then disagree in a good way? And I guess at the same time, how do we make sure that we get our voices across if we have something that we want to put across? So maybe Nathan, you could take this, in the workplace, should we be thinking about who we're communicating with and adapting our communication style depending on that?
Yeah, 100%. And I totally agree with Faye's points around one, yes, diversity is great for business, great for organizations, innovation. It's great for employee retention. There are so many bits of research and data that point to the importance of diverse perspectives, but also diverse people, right? People from different backgrounds who identify in different ways, whether that be gender, race, culture, etc., neurodivergence, and so on. But there is also increasing research around psychological safety. And actually, diversity in and of itself doesn't necessarily lead to innovation. It doesn't necessarily lead to sort of more profitable or more successful organizations if that prerequisite of a psychologically safe environment hasn't been created. So that's something to think about. In terms of how people can have some of these, I guess, challenging conversations around difference, I think about the work that I do in equity, diversity, and inclusion, where a lot of the conversations that we're having are on sensitive subjects and many polarizing subjects as well. And what I practice and what I often encourage people to practice is to aim to understand, right? You are aware that your opinion and perspective may be different from another person's, but actually when we come into a space with our guard up, we come into a space wanting to debate, our desire really isn't to listen to the other person. It isn't to learn from the other person. Our desire is to shut their argument down, prove that our argument is better or more worthy than theirs. And actually, what happens in those environments is no one's listening to anyone. And so what I mean by aim to understand in practice is in those environments, you hear a perspective that's different to your own and you ask the question, where is that coming from for you? What experiences have led you to that conclusion? How did you, come up with that idea? What's influenced you having this idea or this perspective? So you're learning a little bit more about why that person believes the thing that they believe. We take that into sort of more general work context where you might have a disagreement about how a project should be, the approach you should take to a project, for example. You can use a sort of similar approach. So ask questions like, how did this idea come about? What informed the decision to take this approach? Or what steps have you taken to explore various options? So you start by asking the question, and then of course you may find opportunities where there have been gaps in the approach that you can then use as a way in to suggest improvements. And again, you don't want to force your ideas on people. None of us respond well when ideas are being forced on us. So you can say things like, have you considered it from this perspective, right? This is a wonderful approach, and I have an idea that could take it further. And so again, you're affirming the other person and you're introducing new ideas and new perspectives without it feeling like it's a disagreement or a fight.
That's super useful to really think about the language. There are even some kind of phrases that can really help you, and also start from a position of curiosity and interest in the other person and kind of why they believe something or why they've come to this particular conclusion.
Exactly.
Are there times when it's just, this isn't something that we should be disagreeing with, or where it's worth disagreeing with at work? Are there times when we should just let it be? Naomi, maybe you have a thought on that.
Thanks so much. I think it's such a great question. In collective spaces, there are going to be dynamics that emerge that make you uncomfortable, people irritate you. It's only natural. But I think when you're working in a working environment, really what you have to focus on is your professionalism. Collectively, you're there to do a job and everybody knows it. Otherwise, you wouldn't be there. So you really need to make a decision. Is this conflict going to help us do our job better as a team? Is it going to help the organization, or is it just me being in a bad mood? So that's something to really bear in mind, is that your professionalism is your currency in a working environment. Protect it. Make it your primary focus. The next thing I want to say on this point is conflict can sometimes be about your expectations, and managing your own expectations is really important. Did you come to work expecting that you were going to get guidance on this and you were going to get support in this way, and then it doesn't happen and it frustrates you? I'm just going to talk a little bit about the labor market on this point. So the labor market traditionally was that we would enter into an organization. You might go into a physical office space and you might stay there for many number of years, and you would progress through the hierarchy. And so the conflicts that would have emerged in that environment were things like, you might not like it when things change. You don't like changes to your pay structure. You don't think you're getting enough holiday relative to a colleague. But things are very, very different today. And actually, things are changing so quickly that we can't even keep up in terms of our data. So you need to be ready for that. Some of the labor market changes that we're seeing today, there's a lot more of an atomized working environment. Physical offices are not the only way that we can work. There's a lot more remote work. There's a lot more flexible hours. Technology and AI in particular is all over the place, and we don't even know. By the end of this call, it will have changed again. So you really have to strengthen what we call your employability skills. These are things like being on top of tech, being on top of AI and developments, being comfortable handling data. It's going to be necessary in pretty much any work environment. Make sure that you're not coming into your work environment fixed in how you like things done, but be more adaptable. Change is really the essence of contemporary working environments. Be ready for that. You want solid problem-solving skills. It's really valuable to an employer that you can come in and offer a solution rather than argue about the things that are frustrating you. And finally, probably I would say the number one thing, because we're working so much on our own these days, because we have these kind of shattered working environments, everybody doing their own little bit, and because increasingly we're seeing people recruited on the strength of their technical skills rather than the job title, you want to make sure that you're self-sufficient. You want to make sure that you are willing and keen to do things on your own, answering questions for yourself, so that you're minimizing frustrations that you bring to the workplace.
And presumably this world in which you're arguing, Naomi, that people are increasingly on their own and working remotely and maybe not even coming into the office, presumably there's more opportunity perhaps for conflict to arise and disagreement, because you can't even read people. You're not even in a room. You can't necessarily see their body language. Has anyone got some thoughts on that? The kind of
Yeah, I mean,
I can remote work.
Yeah, I can add a little bit on that.
Yeah.
I think what might emerge, and again, we're learning as this happens because it's happening so suddenly and so quickly. But I think the sense of emotional support that you would have got from a team, from those collective environments, that's going to erode slowly over time. And that some people really thrive on their independence and other people don't. They really need that emotional support. So I think the nature of conflict and the difficulties that we'll have will change, whether they're universalizable across the board, whether we will definitely get significantly more conflict as a result of these changes. Maybe I think it's really just a question of the changing nature of conflict.
So part of conflict is disagreeing, but there's also, I guess, a side of conflict, which is just making sure that you can advocate for your own ideas and get your own ideas across. And that's important. That's important in the workplace, really important to be able to say, you know what, I don't agree with this way forward, and these are the reasons. How do we learn to advocate better at work? Faye, looking at you, because I feel you might have some answers on this one.
So I think the first piece is a bit of self-reflection, because I always say, well, why? Why are you pushing your idea? We're all individuals. We all have ideas. That's really good. And it's important that we contribute. But we also have to understand our goals to ensure that we're not being disruptive. And there has to be a purpose to what we're sharing and why we're sharing it. And it should be positive. And once you're past that phase, I think the ways in which we do it is how we communicate. So one of the misconceptions is that all communication is good communication, and that's just not the case. There are different types of communication. There's actually 4 identified types. So just going through them quickly to share, you've got debates. We all know what debate is. It's two-way, it's competitive. We see this a lot, and it doesn't always have a place, and it doesn't always end in a positive outcome. And then you have discourse. And discourse is where you are having this one-way conversation where you're talking at a person. And this is seen a lot as well. We have an idea and we're just telling someone how it should be done. And that isn't constructive either. We've also got diatribe. So this is competitive in one way. And what that looks like is almost posturing. This is the way we should do it because it's the best way to do it. And that's also alienating to others. The correct way to communicate is dialogue, and that's easier said than done, because actually dialogue means that you're stepping back, you are not just speaking, but you're engaging the other party in the way that you communicate your ideas. You are inviting their opinion. You are actually actively listening to their opinion, and then you're trying to work together. And that is the way that you build relationships. And actually, in communicating your ideas, you should also be building relationships with the people that you're speaking to, because that's the best way to kind of advocate for what you want. So I think the best means of advocating is certainly the dialogue, and we should all be conscious as to how we are advocating for our ideas, and conscious in maybe reframing any bad practices that we've picked up over time to make sure that we're doing it as effectively as possible.
Thanks, Faye. That felt that really built upon what Nathan had introduced earlier, and this way of kind of active listening and being curious. Nathan.
Well, yeah, I just wanted to add on to the back of that, because in terms of creating healthy feedback culture, there's a lot of the work that I do around that subject. And there's an interesting statistic that Gallup found, which I've written down here. So they found that 67% of employees whose managers focused on their strengths were fully engaged in their work, compared to only 31% of employees whose managers focused on their weaknesses. Right. As human beings, understandably, we don't really respond well to feedback, even if it is aimed at, improving things that we're not so good at, or changing our approach or changing our style. And so I think there was something in what you said, Faye, around, is it positive? The thing that you want to share, is it going to lead to positive outcomes? And I think it's really important to weigh that up before just diving in and sharing what could be received as really negative feedback. I think we've often probably all had the experience of working with someone who has a lot to say, but their contributions tend to be quite negative. And when you are going to introduce a challenge, you know, you are going to give challenging feedback or constructive feedback, also be prepared to provide some solutions, right? Some alternatives to add that positive outcome to what it is that you're trying to achieve.
That really makes sense. Can we turn now to Gen Z? Rahul, I believe you've done some research into this generation. Is that correct?
Yeah, I have. Thanks, Narina. It would be really bad if I hadn't.
I know.
I'd be on the spot now. Yes, I have. Thank you.
How good are they at managing conflict from your research?
It's a long story. I think I'll try and make it as brief as possible, but I'm conscious that I'm also addressing potentially a cohort of 100 Gen Z here. So I want to preface this part of the discussion by stating that, you know, sweeping generalizations can lead to dangerous stereotypes, and there's never a single approach to or answer to something that spans a generation, because of course we're not all the same, as Faye's mentioned. But that being said, the data does point to trends across the generation as a whole that we can use as a guide to inform us and to prompt thought about what the solutions might be. So my MBA dissertation did focus on how to engage Gen Z employees in the workplace. And it meant that I did a lot of research that I can understand more about that general profile of the generation as a whole. And what came from this is that there's a sharp departure in the values and expectations held by them from those that came before them. So the core finding was that they didn't follow Maslow's hierarchy of needs as anticipated. So normally you'd expect to see a step distribution for motivators, people wanting sort of safety and physiological needs met before anything else. But actually, Gen Z demonstrated a high need across more than the 50 motivators that were identified, and it was almost across the whole. There was a high need for everything. So that kind of points to their high values, high expectations, and inclusivity and flexibility are important to them. So they want to do work with purpose, and they tend to be more driven by their achieving their personal tasks than wider organizational success. So research has shown that this led to direct conflict with millennial managers who struggle to reconcile this with what their approach has been to climbing that workplace ladder. But their high expectations, their employing need for ongoing personal development, there's differences in how they communicate, both behaviorally, practically. Emails, for example, are seen as outdated by some of them. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. It's a short summary, not exhaustive, but it combines to exacerbate that potential for conflict in the workplace. So when you then take into account that they like to have their voices heard, they don't have faith in hierarchical structures, they tend to provide more direct feedback than their predecessor generations, you have this organizational melting pot of potential chaos. And then how they manage conflict itself is not actually that straightforward. The increased levels of anxiety and stress that they suffer from, sensitivity to others' feelings, the desire to maintain sort of positive relationships, contributes to a swathe of the cohort actually being very conflict averse, so not addressing the issues that they see in the workplace. And in general, they can benefit from increased contact time with their line managers, communicating openly, and collaborative approaches being taken to problem solving, where transparency is critical. You know, you need to share with them why are we doing what we're doing and to what end. And working in the field that I do, I've had the privilege of often working with young, fresh thinking leaders. However, when I hear about conflict, it's far too late for anything to be done about it, because it's already escalated to formal processes and the situation's far too out of control. And the thing that I've noticed has been a frustration for senior leaders in organizations I've sort of worked in more recently, is an acute lack of self-awareness of younger leaders, which was potentially exacerbated during COVID. So this then manifests itself into conflict with their teams, because there can be a my way or the highway approach, but an actual lack of appetite to follow due process in managing their teams. So it's not, of course, universal, but it can cause wide-ranging problems, particularly in those labor-intensive and customer-facing industries that kind of I've been exposed to. So one tactic that has been beneficial in ensuring that you kind of reduce conflict is ensuring that personality tests become an intrinsic part of leadership development. Undertaking Myers-Briggs or similar tasks help leaders to be more reflective and self-aware of their own behavior. You know, there's a great free version online, and it's actually something that was a huge personal unlock for myself when I was younger. But this approach has had great results in increasing productivity and in reducing conflict. So addressing this and then layering on training that supports confidence in following process and encouraging employees to reflect on their own inherent biases is something that's really impacted how organizational conflict is sort of managed and then reduced. So as a leader, addressing problems in the moment is critical, and before those issues become too big to sort of manage. And this seems to be something that younger managers in general and employees themselves struggle with. So I guess in short, I don't think there's a simple answer or a magic bullet as to how they manage conflict, because each individual will handle it differently. But the wider research points to it being a challenge in general, and hopefully some of the techniques encourage more healthy and proactive dialogue with conflict. I've probably gone round the houses a bit, but hopefully it kind of addresses the question to a degree.
Yeah, I think lots and lots of food for thought from what you shared, Rahul. And maybe Naomi, because you, am I right, you, part of what you do is you advise young people and kind of what kind of career paths might be right for them. So you presumably you're coming across a lot of Gen Z. Is part of the issue that, you know, when people come to a workplace, there is a set of rules and expectations that workplace already has, and that newcomers need to some degree read that, make sense of that, and then adapt accordingly. Would that be what you'd suggest to people, or would you be saying, no, you know, do it your way and get the organization to follow you?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, again, when we're coming into collective spaces as individuals, we've got to be ready for a little bit of compromise. But actually, this thing about values and whether or not you share values with your organization, the question actually assumes that values are fixed, that we already know who we are so completely in our values when we start working. And most of the time, we don't. There might be some aspects of your values that you're clear on, but there's a lot of growth that happens in the early career space. So two things are really important here. Firstly, there are things that will happen in your life that will completely change your values. You might have a baby and then have a completely different attitude to your income streams. It's only natural. And equally, your values might change as a result of actually learning on the job. So as you're working, as you discover how you interact with other people, as you spend time in an organization that's performing whatever task, you will grow and become more who you are. So your values, you have to kind of embrace the idea that your values will evolve with you, they will change, they will grow and blossom. So the idea that there's this kind of linearity, a dichotomy, it's not really necessarily an accurate picture of how values operate in career spaces.
Okay, all right. So I think be open to the fact that we can change, as well as the fact that our organization can. When it comes back to kind of negotiating difference specifically, are there some differences, some issues that just shouldn't be brought to the workplace, that isn't the place? Nathan, do you?
I mean, yeah, I would say so. There's definitely a few. And I think we've touched on this sort of earlier on in the discussion. But here in the UK, we have something called the Equality Act, which outlines 9 protected characteristics, right? They are age, disability, sex, sexual orientation, marital status, maternity, pregnancy, religion or belief. And I think there's one that I might have missed. Gender reassignment is another one. I think I mentioned disability as well. Of course, if you're going to have clumsy, unhelpful conversations about topics that are either protected characteristics or other topics that are polarizing or sensitive topics, then of course what you're likely going to do is cause harm or cause offense within the workplace, right? So these kinds of conversations have a place where I think, again, thinking about the outcomes that you want to see, again, thinking about what's constructive for this organization, thinking about what's relevant to the organization and the work of the organization as well is really valuable. So if I think of an example, the gender pay gap is a great example of talking about gender in the workplace, right? And wanting to lead to positive outcomes. Perhaps having discussions about your beliefs on abortion might not be as productive, as it may not be as relevant to the organization itself. Or perhaps, you're the sales team and you're having conversations about these things that you perhaps don't have any sort of direct power over. So yeah, I would say there's definitely topics. I think it's about using common sense. Definitely topics that perhaps shouldn't be raised. There are other topics that it's really thinking about why you're raising that topic and how you have meaningful conversations that can lead to change within the organization. The final thing that comes to mind, and we're living in an environment where a lot of organizations have adopted this approach of putting out statements in response to things that are happening in the world. Oftentimes, these are also these also represent sort of polarized opinion topics, right? And so one of the examples was last September. In the UK, we had riots on our streets, right? There was violence on our streets, hotels were being set on fire, lots of things were happening. And I've spoken to leaders in organizations who said, oh, we really made a mistake because we took too long to put out a statement and declare our stance on what was going on. And I said, well, actually, I don't know that putting out statements is really that valuable without some kind of action. And so rather than, taking a political stance on something that's happening, why not observe how this is impacting the people who work for your organization? Why not observe how this is impacting the people who access your services and then take direct action in response to that? So going back to that example, some of the practical things that organizations did were like, if there's unrest where you live, if your commute is disrupted, you can work from home. There are plans for these riots to be happening on this street. Well, we're not offering our services. We're closing down the services on that street. We're going to direct all of our service users or our customers to use another service where they're unlikely to encounter the unrest. So it's encouraging organizations to really think about the impact of these perhaps polarizing issues on the people that work for you, on the people that access your services, and then take direct action rather than just putting out statements about what side you're on or not on.
Thank you. Thank you. Rahul, I know you had your
helpful.
hand up, so I just want to make sure we get to you on this as well.
Yeah, I just from a people perspective, kind of piggybacking off of Nathan's initial point on sort of protected characteristics, it's the thing that kind of has HR, and I'm sure Faye from a legal background has their backup immediately, because it's the thing that can really impact an organization on a much wider scale, because you end up in horrible tribunal situations. And we can even see reputationally the impact in the last few days on Vivienne Westwood, for example, hitting the newspapers and stuff like that from really having poor behaviors from the top of the organization, and that just being allowed because someone was in a CEO role. And actually the impact that that's now having reputationally on the organization, and whether there'll then be boycotts from certain communities or certain individuals, it's something that we just need. I guess there's a basic level of behavior on a practical basis, I guess, just using common sense. What are things that you might say, in the privacy of your own home to your brother or your sister or whatever it may be, versus a thing that you're going to say to someone who you don't know what they're looking for in their life. You don't know what their career ambitions are. You don't know what situation they've got going on at home. It becomes horrible. So there's that element of common sense alongside protected characteristics. It's what would you say at home versus what would you say at work, and it all ties into Naomi's point on I guess professionalism as well.
And I guess nowadays, it's not only what you say at work, it might also be what you share in a WhatsApp group with work colleagues, what you say if you go to the pub after work with your colleagues. So it's thinking about, not necessarily only when you're physically in the workspace or in a Zoom. Just on the Vivienne Westwood point, because I haven't followed the case, presumably these are alleged claims that I haven't followed it, but we should just be clear if it is still in process that this is.
I think the tribunal finished.
Oh, it is.
Years
Sorry.
ago, and I think it's whistleblowing now.
I just wanted to be sure that we weren't.
But also it comes back to the perception of whether something is right or wrong and the impact of that on an organization. So whether a tribunal finds something has happened or hasn't, if you've got whistleblowers saying something has happened and this is how they've been impacted, the number of now, celebrities, fashionistas coming out and talking about this and their experience of it, it leads to something else that is just really impactful to an organization. So
yes,
just the allegation itself is bad enough. And then I think oftentimes from an HR perspective, I've got to say that the old-fashioned phrase of, there's no smoke without fire or whatever, can be true. There's always something that trickles something, but it's not always someone is found guilty of something, but it's something that triggers a wider conversation, and that might be what happens to them now, that they have a bigger conversation.
I think we won't talk about a specific case because I think the rest of the panel, me included, doesn't necessarily have the details on that, but I think the point that you're making is a valid point, that if things kind of escalate, a brand is going to suffer, including amongst its customers for sure. Faye, you wanted to...
Yeah, so just shifting slightly, I think there is this piece, we've heard this phrase, bring your whole self to work. And I think that there is a responsibility that comes with that. And what is quite dangerous is a sense of entitlement, that bring your whole self to work means that you can spout views that are offensive. And I think we also need to remember as individuals that it's a two-way street. So if you start to shape a culture where almost reckless things can be said, that comes two ways, and often you can be offended as well by comments that other people make. So there is this piece about responsibility in the workplace, and that bringing your whole self to work means being you. But it also means being responsible because you are in a professional environment. And it's what Naomi has said. We need to remember that when we go to work, we're paid to do a job, and there has to be a balance. Openness and transparency is really important, but just being mindful of those around us in the same way we'd want others to be mindful of us goes a long way, I think.
Thank you, Faye. That's a really good point, I think, to stop the panel part of our conversation and allow for some Q&A from the audience. And we've actually had a number of questions which have been put on the Q&A. So I think I will read some out, and anyone from the panel who wants to answer, please raise your hand. So let's start with, and excuse me if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly, Michal Zaluska's question, saying everything the panel's mentioned makes a lot of sense. That's good to know. However, it is based on the assumption that the boss or manager is open to dialogue. What would be the best course of action if that isn't the case? Should I consider changing jobs? So this is if your boss or manager isn't open to dialogue, or is there a way to effectively communicate in this case? Does anyone want to take that? Nathan?
Well, I'm laughing because this question comes up a lot, and I think my response often isn't the response that people expect me to say, which is perhaps going back to Naomi's point around values as well, right? So if the leader of an organization plays a particular role in creating the values and the culture of that organization, so I would definitely say consider, if you do have other options, if this organization and the ways of working do align with your values, and be open to exploring the idea of going somewhere else. I'm not one of those traditionalists who's like, I'm going to work for this organization for 20 years and receive, what do they give out, those awards for your long tenure, like a free watch or
Like a
something. I don't know.
clock.
But, yeah, my granddad got this watch for working for this company for 50 years, and he was really proud of it. But it's like, yeah, we don't do that anymore. So yeah, I wouldn't say stay fixed, but I would say sometimes it's about strategically influencing. A point that I was trying to get to earlier was around really thinking about the outcomes that you want to see um, when you're making sort of challenging feedback or giving challenging feedback, and also take the time to reflect on how is the best way to put this forward? How best can I influence a perspective that is, in some ways, it could be quite far away from your own perspective, and be honest about the journey that that individual might have to go on. It could take 6 months, it could take 12 months, it could take 5 years if you're willing to stay that long. Think about the reality of how many steps that individual might have to go through to changing their behaviors and changing their values. Sometimes it's possible, sometimes it isn't.
Faye, you wanted to come in on this question of
Yeah.
should he change jobs, or is there a way to effectively communicate this issue? What if the boss or manager isn't open to dialogue?
So a slightly different view to Nathan. But I think we have to remember that organizations are made up of lots of different people and everyone's different. And I would ask that individual to consider what is the impact that this manager or boss is having on you. Because if the wider culture of the company suits you really well and you form good friendships, I would say no, you don't jump ship for one individual. We have to remember that in the workforce, people move around. And you can find many personalities in just about every organization. So there are other steps you can take first, such as maybe there's another role you can move to within the same company. Maybe there is a secondment that you can do if it's not a permanent move, or just consider, I think there's a line where if it's impacting your health, then that's very different. But if it's just frustrating, annoying, and inconvenience, but the organization suits you, I would say probably stay put and maybe they'll move.
Naomi, do you have a third view, or are you going to support either Faye or Nathan on this?
It's a hot topic, but I just wanted to make another contribution from the careers perspective. I think when it comes to conflict in the workplace, one thing we might have to bear in mind is that conflict might actually originate just in ourselves. Certainly, this was my own story. I didn't make the right selections when I was in my early career. I was in strategic communications. It really didn't work for me. There was a lot of tension within me about what I'd chosen. And to Faye's point, this has come up a few times, actually, also Nathan. Just take a moment to examine the real source of that conflict. We make assumptions about where the conflict is, and we blame things instantaneously, but taking the time just to process it and examining carefully the source of that conflict will really help you to mitigate things.
Interesting point. Can we take a question from somebody? They haven't given their name. It's a great question. Thank you all. They begin. As a young Black woman in the predominantly male field of engineering, I often encounter conflicts related to gender issues. For instance, being undermined and spoken over in meetings. It can be challenging to articulate these experiences to others who may not recognize them. And there's always the risk of being perceived as the problem due to existing biases. How do you navigate such situations? Great question. Thoughts?
Yeah, I think the first piece is speaking up, because we've talked about assumptions. There is this blank space that's often filled with assumptions in the absence of communication. And it may be that people around this individual are used to a way of working and a culture, and they don't recognize the impact it's having on this individual. So the first bit is to speak up and explain, maybe one-on-one with just one individual who's possibly a bit more outspoken in their behaviors, and explain to them what you're experiencing and what the impact is on you, and see how that plays out first. Because I think sometimes it's often an unawareness of the impact behaviors are having.
Naomi, you also wanted to speak on this.
Yes, I just wanted to put my heart out really, but this is again in the careers industry, we hear a lot about this, but women just are not given. I mean, I was just watching Taylor Swift, dare I admit that, but I was just watching her talk about this exact issue that women are perceived as being calculating when men are perceived as being strategic for exactly the same behavior. I mean, my comment on that was I think it's a very real reality. I don't think that we've come to any solutions on this point yet in terms of how women are perceived and how communications are treated as equal. The language of communications, the space for communications on these issues, I don't think we've made enough progress on that. So essentially, my heart goes out to you on that point.
I mean, some of the companies, as chair, just also make a comment on this. Most of the companies I work, all the companies whose boards I'm on, have got kind of strong employee resource groups, female ones. And I wonder if finding your allies within the organization is also a good strategy, where you're not necessarily talking about, you know, a particular manager who's behaving in a particular way or a particular colleague, but where you're kind of combining forces, and if necessary, as a group, being able to then come to the organization and go, you know, we might have a problem here for a whole group of people, and that might be something perhaps to think about. Faye, did you want to?
Yeah, I was just going to say that the point that you've made is really important, because if it's collective, it feels like a cultural issue rather than an individual. And therefore, if you have support on a wider scale, I think that's definitely the right way to go when you're changing cultural behaviours rather than individual issues.
Great. Okay. This is one that makes me laugh as somebody who's not a Gen Z myself, but I'll throw this out here. As a anonymous question, as a Gen Zer myself, I find myself getting most frustrated in the workplace when I'm working with individuals who have been in their job for a long time and are counting the days until retirement. Do you have any advice on how to deal with colleagues like this and how to excel without putting others down? So this is this whole issue which companies are really trying to figure out, intergenerational workplaces where you have Gen Z and where you have boomers and when you have Gen X. Any tips from the panel on how to manage this, Rahul?
Yeah, I think this is something that comes up without knowing the specific thing that is the frustration to you, apart from if they're just sitting there waiting for their retirement. I think there is a real area of opportunity to be curious yourself as a Gen Zer and learn from them about their experience in the role, whether you intend to see out your retirement in the same organization or move on to others, but gain some knowledge from them. But also there's this knowledge transfer piece of a lot of the reported frustrations in research comes down to basically technological illiteracy of the older generation that is seen by Gen Zers. And I think someone who's in the middle, I would see myself as quite technological, but I know that younger people would see me as a sort of ogre who doesn't know how to use a computer. So I think that's natural with technological development, but I think there's that piece of, well, what value can you add to them and what value can you extract from them? And really do something around that knowledge transfer to kind of gain some skills for yourself. And I guess look at their tenure and their desire to eke out their days in a positive way. Just try and get something from them. Without knowing the specifics of what it is that is frustrating you, I guess that's the most that I can offer you.
I mean, something I've seen which is pretty effective in organizations is when they have reverse mentoring schemes. Yeah. So when, like, you know, the older employees, but it's not one way, and then everyone's learning from everyone, and that can be super effective. I'm aware that we've only got 6 minutes left and that we haven't been able to answer everyone's questions, so I'm sorry about that. But I just want to end today with maybe going around the panel with a question that we haven't covered yet that I would like us to address, which is one of the things I found in my research is that one of the best ways of managing difference is to discover what we have in common and focus on what unites us rather than pulls us apart. Have my panel got thoughts on how either employers can help you do this in the workplace or things that you can do in the workplace yourself to help to try and figure out what you have in common with your fellow employees rather than your points of difference? any of my panelists? Nathan.
I'm happy to go ahead,
Right.
especially because there was also a question. I wanted to share this anyway, but there's also a question on practical things that organizations can do to create a psychologically safe working environment. The four key practices, or the four key areas, are that you want people to be able to ask for help, put ideas forward, challenge the status quo or give challenging feedback, and make mistakes, all without being penalized. So as an individual or as an organization, if you can find ways to ensure that you're communicating the importance of each of these 4 points, you're practicing them yourself, and you're also challenging the culture when it doesn't quite align with those principles, you're helping to create that psychologically safe environment.
Thank you. Rahul.
Yeah, I think really super short. I think organizations should celebrate individuality and conduct what I would say is informative, not performative DE&I programs. So really sharing that sort of, I guess, common purpose, but sharing knowledge to people. And I think that helps with the ERGs, but it helps just through a cohesive DEI program. It's not about sticking something on Instagram. It's about doing something that makes a change. And then as an individual, it's really basic. I've touched on it already, but demonstrate common sense and know when to walk away, because there's sometimes times where you just don't want to engage. Get yourself out of there before it becomes a bigger problem. And that's from my HR background and a number of cases where we could have just nipped something in a bud, and we haven't. We've gone full frontal.
Yeah, that's really good advice. Take that beat. Yeah, really good advice. Naomi.
I just wanted to share with you something that my director shared with me when I was at work, which was a really lovely little thing that you can remember. And that's fundamentally that at work, everybody's doing their best. Everybody's always trying to do their best. So if there is conflict, just remember, everybody's trying to do their best. And also something that's come up a number of times today is this allusions to Maslow's hierarchy of needs and psychological safety. So the human needs theory of conflict, this is just about identifying that we all have shared needs. So psychological safety and a sense of belonging and a sense of identity. If these things that we all share are being threatened, then the argument is that they're what create potential for conflict. So when you do find yourself in a conflict situation or some point of difference, just remember to think of it in terms of shared needs, and it might help you to interpret things correctly.
Thank you. Faye.
I think agree with everything that's been said. The additional piece I would say is the communication and openness. Building bonds is really important. And that communication done in the right way takes away the room for assumptions, and that reduces the conflict that you can have, but also reduces the negative output that can come when there isn't that understanding. So I'd say as individuals, we should be willing to not just communicate, but also listen and build bonds with others that goes beyond the day-to-day job.
Yes, and actually fascinating research that I've seen at places of work, employees that eat together and so have that time to break bread and talk about kind of their families and their lives and non-work stuff, not only are much happier and much more engaged, but also are much more productive. So Rahul, I can see your hand up, but we're coming right to the end. Is your hand not meant to be up? Okay. So we're coming right to the end. I think I have to hand over to Gerard, but before I do, I want to thank all my panelists. You've been great. You've shared some really great insights. Thank you to all the questions that were asked. And I'm sorry to those who we weren't able to answer directly. And thank you to UCL for hosting this for us all today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you for the slides, Emily. So first, I just want to say huge thanks to Nerina for chairing the discussion so excellently, and to Faye, Nathan, Rahul, and Naomi. Lots of insights there and lots of really great questions. So really appreciate all your insights. Two quick things just for me to plug. The first is that we've heard from a wonderful panel here of alumni volunteers. If any of you on the call are keen to volunteer and give back to the community, there's so much you can do, from mentoring current students, speaking at careers events, delivering workshops, and even hosting students in your workplace. So there's a QR code there and there's a link that I can put in the chat after this, and the sort of follow-up email going out to everyone who's registered. So if you're interested, let us know. And then finally, and most importantly, please do give us feedback on this event. Again, I'll put the link to the form in the chat. It will take you 2 minutes, and it will be so helpful in terms of helping us improve our offering and what we give to our alumni and student community. That is all from me. I'm going to end the call now and stop the recording. But yes, huge thank you, Nerina, Faye, Nathan, Raoul, and Naomi. And I'll send you a link for our debrief call later. But yes, thank you everyone for joining, and enjoy the rest of your day.